morning. Welcome to the 3B Report. I'm Joey.
And I'm Isabella.
And I'm Marlena.
Today is Tuesday, February 28th.
Last week's 3B award winners were Luke F. from Mrs. Marshall's class,
Carter from Mrs. Raft,
Emma from Mrs. Raft,
Simon from Mrs. Raft,
Sean from Mrs. Raft,
Nora from Mrs. Raft,
Nick from Mrs. Raft,
Cassette from Mrs. Raft,
Magnus from Miss Moore,
Tristan T. from Mrs. DeGrand,
Nora from Mrs. Raft,
Mrs. Moore,
Lucas from Mrs. Moore,
Caden P. from Mrs. Moore,
Lexi P. from Mrs. Bever,
Brady W. from Mrs. Moore,
Libby H. from Mrs. Checklitz,
Natalie S. from Mrs. Bever,
Nolan from Mrs. Chocolates,
Adam R. from Mrs. DeGrand,
Logan B. from Mrs. Bever,
Austin L. from Mrs. Jungle,
Riley V. from Mrs. Junga,
Benjamin F. from Mrs. Junga,
Lauren P. from Mrs. Jungle,
Kyle Wright from Mrs. Black,
Jessica F. from Mrs. Black,
Caden P. from Mrs. Moore,
Jaden J. from Mrs. Marshall,
Brett H. from Mrs. Marshall.
I'm done. Today's lunch choices are chicken nuggets or spaghetti with meatballs.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and the Resolution of Respect.